Hello, I'm Nicholas Henshall. I'm the Vicar of St Thomas's here in Groombridge in East Sussex, and this is the next part of the Lent course here at St Thomas's. We've been focusing on the New Testament as a whole, and today John's Gospel. There'll be a second video this week which will focus on Revelation. Two very, very different books. Just because they appear to be connected by a name, don't be misled. But yeah, so John's Gospel and Revelation, these will be the last two videos of this course, but during Holy Week there'll be a series of small videos, so to speak, focusing on characters in the Passion. So, John's Gospel. In the John Rylands Library in Manchester, there is a tiny piece of papyrus, a fragment containing the text of John 18:31-33. This is the earliest piece of New Testament manuscript in existence in the world today, stated to around 150 AD, just a few decades after John was written. It's tantalising and somehow very exciting. Over the last 60 years, probably no other book in the New Testament has been re-evaluated more than John's Gospel. Yes, always venerated in the Eastern churches as the foundational gospel. In the Western churches, however, it's often been regarded as a bit of a Cinderella, as an outlier, used rather to fill the gaps in the other three Gospels. And that's been true in Christian worship as much as in scholarship. In that the Sunday lectionary typically uses John only in certain seasons and rarely in sequence. It's sort of filling in the gaps again. It's often been referred to as the spiritual gospel, which I think it deeply is, but that also kind of marginalises it. It's kind of holy in a very particular way. And that's partly, of course, as a result also of the unique portrait of Jesus in John, which is so startlingly different in structure, content and time frame from the other three canonical Gospels. The otherness of John's Gospel has frequently led to it being seen as a somewhat marginal text, shall we say? And yet, over the last 60 years, there has been a revolution in the study of John, to the point where one great contemporary theologian, David Ford, sees it as perhaps the most influential single text on Christian thought during the last 2 millennia. I mean, that's an extraordinary statement. John, having been on the margins, certainly in the Western Church, is very much back in the mainstream. So let's have a look at a bit of background here. There are 5 books in the New Testament which have customarily borne the name John. There's the Gospel, 3 short letters, and of course Revelation. Early tradition made 2 assumptions, neither of which necessarily stand up. One, that all 5 of these pieces were by the same author, and secondly, that author was John, the brother of James, also known as the beloved disciple. I simply note that this equation is not made anywhere in the Gospel itself. Most commentators do accept that that the 3 letters are generally Johannine, although not necessarily by John, the author of the Gospel. And as we shall see in a separate video, it is extremely unlikely that Revelation is by the same John as the Gospel. As for the date of the Gospel, there's wide agreement that certainly in the form we have it, John is the latest written down Gospel, perhaps as late as 110 AD. However, as far as I'm concerned, and these are not the most interesting issues about John's Gospel. So what's different about the 4th Gospel? Certainly by comparison with the 3 so-called synoptic Gospels, quite a lot is different, at least on a first reading. As we've already noted, John is distinctive in shape, in structure, in content, in perspective, and much, much more. Because as Western Christians, we've generally assumed that the structure, content and time frame shared by Matthew, Mark and Luke is the right one, so to speak, it may be easier to identify the otherness of John by briefly outlining what is not in John, but which we take for granted in the other Gospels. So here goes. There is no 40 days in the wilderness. There is no Sermon on the Mount or Sermon on the Plain, though of course there isn't one in Mark either. Jesus tells no parables in John, heals no lepers. He doesn't mention the Lord's Prayer. Again, neither does Mark. Remarkably, in John, Jesus doesn't mention bread and wine at the Last Supper, and instead describes Jesus washing his disciples' feet. Most significantly, perhaps, in all of this, is that the time frame is different for Holy Week. Although the Last Supper is still on Thursday, it's not on a Passover, it's the day before the Passover. And Friday, yes, he dies on the Friday, but it's not the Sabbath, it's the day before the Sabbath. So the time frame is very, very different, both I would suggest for reasons of history and for reasons of theology. And whereas in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus essentially only makes one journey to Jerusalem, in John, he goes back and forth all the time. It's also worth noting that demonic activity is entirely absent from the fourth gospel. Jesus does not cast out any demons, even in his healings. Again, I would suggest that this is because in John, Jesus is sovereign. As he says in his words of reassurance to the disciples at the Last Supper, I have overcome the world. And there is that real sense running through the gospel. And alongside these contrasts, John's Gospel has a huge amount of material that's simply not found in the Synoptic Gospels, although there are many cross-references which suggest, and to an increasing number of writers today, that John was aware of the other three Gospels rather than writing independently, as a previous generation assumed. Perhaps the most significant difference of all is that whereas in Mark, and to some extent Matthew and Luke, people fail to recognise who Jesus is, i.e. the Messiah, in John's Gospel the identity of Jesus as Messiah is absolutely clear from the outset. Lord, the kind of messianic title, is used throughout the Gospel in sharp contrast to Matthew, Mark and Luke. This is the Lord of the universe. This is the Word made flesh. A very distinctive aspect of this is that Jesus repeatedly uses the name of God from Exodus 3:15 of himself. That's where God says, I am what I am. Jesus uses that again and again in this gospel. It is found occasionally in the other gospels, which would confirm that it's a known title of Jesus. But in the fourth gospel, it's repeated. It's a theme. The reader of John's gospel is left in no doubt from beginning to end that Jesus is God. Finally, before we dive into the text, a word about abiding. If immediately is one of Mark's most distinctive words, and if disciple is one of Matthew's most distinctive words, and the prodigal son is the most distinctive story in Luke's gospel, then in John it is the word abiding. Abiding. That's very close to the heart of John's gospel. It's a single Greek root word of just 3 letters, but used again and again and again throughout the Gospel of John, although inevitably this repetition isn't easily captured in translation. In John, you could almost go so far to say that abiding is the nature of God and the nature of the Christian calling. This is partly why John is seen at the most Trinitarian of all the Gospels, although of course the word Trinity doesn't itself occur in the New Testament. John has this deep sense of God, Father, Son and Holy Spirit abiding in one another, a mutual indwelling. And this abiding is the relationship into which we are invited, both with each other and with God. So something about structure. The fourth gospel has a relatively simple structure. Essentially, it is a single continuous extended narrative moving towards an extraordinary climax in the death and resurrection of Jesus, which is immediately followed by the sending of the Holy Spirit. This is one of the reasons that John, unlike the synoptics, does not lend itself easily to being split into neat sections. You can't sort of just take 4 verses. No, it's a continuous narrative. Nonetheless, here's a brief summary if it helps. So it begins with a prologue. The Word is made flesh and dwells among us. Then the first half, up to virtually the end of chapter 12, is often called the Book of Signs. The Word reveals himself to his own, but his own do not accept him. And then the second part, sometimes called the Book of Glory, this is only by commentators, I promise, where to those who accept him, the Word shows his glory by returning to the Father in death, resurrection and ascension, and fully glorified sends the Paraclete. And then in chapter 21, there is a brief epilogue. Now we're going to journey through the fourth gospel. I hope this is helpful. I mean, it's like, if you like, my reading of the text in a summarised form. The fourth gospel launches with exactly the same words as the book of Genesis, in the beginning. That's making a big claim. This is the new book of Genesis. It then goes on to describe the pre-existent Word being made flesh and pitching his tent among us. That's quite important. That's actually what it says in the original. He pitched his tent among us. And then the witness of God, John the Baptist, bearing witness, though a very different portrait of the Baptist than the one we find in the other Gospels. However, John the Baptist's purpose is the same, to point to Jesus. It is notable that the Baptist does describe the baptism of Jesus, but doesn't say that he baptized Jesus. Jesus then calls his first disciples, and here we immediately see the distinctiveness of John. It isn't, come follow me, no. Jesus turns around to find two of John the Baptist's disciples following him. And what does he say? The very first words of Jesus in the gospel. What are you looking for? What are you looking for? A phrase that will recur later in the gospel. We should also note that whilst the narrative flows, Jesus Jesus doesn't simply say, follow me. He enters into an extended encounter using humour and irony along the way. And as we go forward, you'll see that's characteristic of Jesus throughout the fourth gospel. An encounter leads to reflection, leads to a discourse, leads to more reflection, leads to relationship with lots of humour and irony and misunderstanding. Chapter 2 opens with Jesus turning water into wine. Now, this is the first of 7 signs that shape the structure of John's Gospel. John chooses the word sign rather than miracle. His language suggests that signs are more than merely miracles, although they are miraculous. Somehow they point beyond themselves and can be understood on multiple levels, which also makes reading John's Gospel quite an extraordinary and different experience. And although we can see connections between some of the signs and some of the miracles in the other Gospels, they are presented in a very different way. And typically, unlike Matthew, Mark and Luke, Jesus reflects on these with expansive discourses, additional conversations and so forth. It's worth noting that there's only one sign stroke miracle common to all 4 Gospels, and that is the feeding of the 5,000. Clearly a miracle that was immensely important to the early Christian community, as I would suggest it should be for us. Jesus then immediately goes on to cleanse the temple. Now in Matthew, Mark and Luke, that takes place in the last week of Jesus' life and is very much associated with his arrest and trial. It's one of the offences that really finally seals the deal. In John's Gospel, something different's happening. The antagonistic relationship between Jesus and the Jewish elite is established from the very beginning, from his very first sign. An extended conversation, a discourse, then follows with Nicodemus. That takes up the whole of chapter 3. A remarkable encounter, Nicodemus who comes to Jesus by night. In the conversation, note that Jesus makes it clear to Nicodemus this major theme, that Jesus has not come to save Christians or good people or nice people or even people, but the whole created order. God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. The whole created order. The word used in John is cosmos, as in cosmic. Then immediately we're thrown into another encounter, this time with a Samaritan woman. This is someone Jesus should have absolutely nothing to do with. And yet this becomes yet another extended conversation about the water of life or living water. And note here that sense in John that the conversation proceeds by misunderstanding. Jesus is talking about living water, water of life, whereas the woman thinks this means she won't have to carry on coming back to the well to fill up her bucket. So you see what's going on. There's comedy there, there's irony here, but all of it with serious purpose. And let's note the point in these conversations. They are addressed to us. We are, so to speak, the audience. We are eavesdropping on these conversations, and we're invited to discern for ourselves the message that the Samaritan woman fails to grasp. The second sign is the healing of the ruler's son in chapter 4. We're back in Cana of Galilee, the site of the first sign. Again, the ruler is someone Jesus should have nothing to do with, a pagan. But Jesus simply says, in answer to the request for healing, says, your son will live. At the same time, Jesus complains that all people seem to want is signs and miracles. In the following chapter, we're in Jerusalem again, and Jesus heals a sick man at a pool. I mean, it's worth noting these miracles in John, these signs, are not like in Matthew, Mark and Luke, where it's just Jesus does something and then moves on. They're whole structures in themselves. They're extended narratives, as I say. This healing takes place on the Sabbath, a theme definitely familiar from the other Gospels, and this prompts threats from the Jews to kill Jesus. In response, a long discourse reflects on the relationship between Jesus and the Father. This sense of Jesus' constant communion with the Father, his abiding in, as we've noted, is central to the fourth gospel and develops into this deeply Trinitarian feel to it, although, as we said, the word Trinity isn't used. The fourth sign, the feeding of the 5,000. I've clearly got the wrong order if not careful, but there we are. As by now we expect in John, John does not simply perform the sign, but after another sign, the walking on the water, delivers an extraordinary meditation on Jesus, the bread of life. I am the bread of life. I am again the name for God. Jesus again finds himself at odds with the authorities, and there are attempts made to arrest him in Jerusalem. Though we're not even halfway through the gospel at this point. Jesus speaks of living water and himself as the light of the world, another lengthy and profound reflection. And then along comes chapter 9. Oh, the healing of the man born blind. Now, this is the sixth sign. I could go on about this for hours, and indeed many books have been written just about chapter 9 alone. It works on so many levels. And as with the whole of John, I would strongly recommend spending time with this chapter. The healing of the man born blind is the penultimate sign in the gospel. At one level, it's a straightforward narrative about a man receiving his sight. Sight he's never had before, as he was born blind, thus emphasising the remarkable nature of the healing. At the same time, as with the trope of blindness elsewhere in the New Testament, it's a rebuke to the Jewish elite, who claim that they can see, but are really blind, as they cannot see who Jesus is. Jesus makes this point very, very directly in verses 35 to 41 of chapter 9. Put bluntly, he's saying the Pharisees, you're blind, but you think you can see. They're walking in darkness, and light and darkness work in John's gospel in all sorts of ways. And once again, the Sabbath breaking is another major source of tension. As for the healed man, it's made clear at the outset that he has not asked to be healed. Now that's worth noting, isn't it? He's not asked to be healed. Jesus has just healed him. And Jesus says the purpose of this sign is to reveal what God is doing. Again, Jesus uses the name of God, of himself, as he says, I am the light of the world. Yes, I am the name of God. It's hard not to feel sympathy for the man born blind, as he's now lost his livelihood as a beggar, he's disowned by his parents, and he's been thrown out of the synagogue. Many commentators have seen here a reflection of the experience of the early Christian community, which may well be so, but overwhelmingly here Jesus is seeking to demonstrate the sovereignty of God. Chapter 10 is devoted to another series of I am sayings. I am the good shepherd. I am the gate of the sheep. Each time Jesus is saying that, it's blasphemy. He's calling himself God. Well, or he is God. The crowd make clear that they think this is blasphemy and attempt to stone him to death. Jesus is rejected by the Jews, and both Jesus' identity and his rejection by his own people reach their climax in the extraordinary, and I would suggest definitive, sign, the raising of Lazarus, which again, in typical style, leads directly to Jesus' meditation, I am the resurrection and the life. This last scandalous sign ramps up the opposition as there are plots to kill not just Jesus but Lazarus too. It's approaching Passover. The atmosphere is thickening. Jesus is staying with Mary, Martha and Lazarus at Bethany, and the scene pointing forwards to his death, Mary anoints the Lord. So we're halfway through John, and then the second half, sometimes known as the Book of Glory, is beginning at chapter 13-14. Jesus is now in Jerusalem for Passover, and at supper he washes his disciples' feet and speaks about the new commandment, love one another as I have loved you. At the supper, which as we've noted is not a Passover in John, but does take place the day before the Passover, Jesus engages in a series of very extended discourses. Sometimes, Again, part of what's going on here is that Jesus is addressing us. We are being invited to eavesdrop on his conversations with the disciples. And then in chapter 17, he turns away from the disciples. And somehow we're now eavesdropping on the disciples, eavesdropping on Jesus, talking to the Father. It's very beautiful. It's very, very beautiful. Jesus speaks to himself as the true vine. Another beautiful example of this theme of abiding in him. That we are, I am the tree, I am the vine. You are the branches. He speaks words of hope, consolation, promise, and of the Holy Spirit. Now, inevitably, when we get to the next stage, Jesus' arrest and trial, the Passion narratives all very much share the same territory. But, as we might expect, John does it very differently. Even his arrest is a moment of divine epiphany. They arrive in the garden, and we miss this often, and Jesus says to the troops, "Who are you looking for?" And they say, "Jesus of Nazareth," and Jesus says, "I am." He doesn't say, "I am he." He says, "I am the name of God." And what do the people who've come to arrest him do? They fall flat on their faces. This is a divine epiphany. So the moment of Jesus' arrest in John's Gospel is a moment of divine epiphany. That is truly extraordinary. The great writer on John, Raymond Brown, goes as far as to say that in John there is no passion narrative at all. It's much rather a journey to glory. Jesus remains in control throughout the passion narrative. Right through the trials with the high priest and with Pilate, and Pilate even obliquely recognises Jesus' own divinity. Jesus has no need of Simon of Cyrene, who does not appear in the fourth gospel. He very much carries his own cross. John emphasises that very, very sharply. And of course, the words at the end. And what do we get? Matthew and Mark have, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That cry of desolation from Psalm 22. In Luke's Gospel, we get that cry of obedience. "Into your hands I commit my spirit," from Psalm 31. In John, something quite different. Jesus ends with a shout of triumph. It is completed. I've got to my goal. I hate it in some of those passion plays where you kind of go, "Oh, it's finished." No, that is not what it means. It means I've reached the target. I've reached where I was going to go. And so very, very different. And the cross is the symbol of victory and enthronement. This is where the Lord is revealed in all his glory. Jesus even remains active in his death, with the sacraments of the church flowing blood and water from his wounded side. And finally, the resurrection appearances in the fourth gospel are, as of course we now expect, distinctive. They are far more extensive than in Matthew, Mark and Luke. And again, the risen Jesus does not simply appear, but engages with the people he encounters. This is most striking in the first encounter with Mary Magdalene, the encounter with Thomas, where the risen Jesus is recognised, of course, by his wounds, and the extraordinary encounter with Peter at the lakeside that closes the gospel. If nothing else, I hope I've communicated my enthusiasm for this extraordinary and unique account of Jesus, one that has the power to sustain, to challenge, to comfort, and to give extraordinary hope as we go on the journey of faith.